A couple months ago, I put out a call for my supporters to submit decks for potential review. After picking out some decks to look at, carefully going through them, and getting distracted a whole bunch of times along the way, I am now presenting to you the reviews. Enjoy! The first deck I'll be discussing is Alex's deck, 11st Birthday Party, and this is also the first of 3 Lord of the Rings decks I'll be talking about today. This is a Bilbo life gain deck, with multiple potential play paths and routes to victory. The bread and butter is the life gain, obviously, and this deck has a lot of it. About 20 cards that seem here primarily for the purpose of life gain, and another 20 that accomplish some other task, but also incidentally gain life. Some of this life gain is in the form of big splashy cards like Celestial Mantle and Tainted Sigil, but most of it is in more incremental sources, such as Soul Sisters and lifelink creatures. This plays into a small drain package in the deck, which has a mixture of cards that drain on their own and cards that drain opponents whenever you gain life, such as Starscape Cleric. There are also a couple Pridemate-style creatures, which offer a further way to put forward damage. Supporting these interweaving game plans is a healthy protection suite, a moderate amount of card draw, and more modest numbers of both ramp and ways to interact with opposing plays. I mentioned that this deck is doing a good job layering its different roles, and that is absolutely true, particularly with life gain. There are a whole lot of cards that gain life and do something else as well, and in theory, this could result in a very compact-feeling deck. However, I see this effect likely being somewhat hindered by the specifics, with many of these cards not seeming to support this deck's game plan very well. We can see this in a lot of the deck's lifelink creatures. Leyline Prowler is a ramp creature with lifelink, but the deck doesn't really need a 3-mana ramp creature. Dragonlord Ramoka is an Abolisher creature with lifelink, but I don't know that this deck really wants that effect for 2 mana, let alone 6. There are also cards like Battle at the Bridge and Erebos' Intervention, which do staple life gain onto removal, but this deck runs very little ramp to counteract the mana inefficiency of these. I think it's worth running an audit on this deck's life gain cards and asking if they actually mesh with the deck's game plan, because I'd say it's better to have your support guards be better tuned to the deck's play patterns than it is to have something out of place that also gains little life. This deck's later game plan is also interesting to me. The deck has a handful of pingers like Dina, Blight Priest, and Starscape Cleric, which seem nice paired with the deck's Soul Sister style cards, although there aren't enough of these to guarantee one consistently, nor recursion to keep them around. This is paired with the inclusion of kind of a weird blend of different life gain sources and payoffs, some being decidedly creature-oriented, and some a bit less so. My best theory about the drain cards is that there's intended to be just enough of them to one-shot all opponents with a Bilbo activation, which makes some sense to me as a compact-ish win con, and this deck does have plenty of life gain to push toward that magic 111 number. Still, I'd love to see this deck pick a synergy element and push harder into it, preferably one that does things with lots of small life gain triggers, since that's what Bilbo's triggered ability rewards. Alex also mentioned worrying about board wipes, and a sub-theme that would likely help this deck out there is one centered around low power or low mana value creatures. This gives access to tutors like Ranger of Eos, and it also gives some sweet recursion options like Abiding Grace, Dusk Dawn, Ascend from Avernus, and Raise the Past. If you can build around these a bit, they'll give a great option for bouncing back, and you also have colors available to go even deeper into graveyard themes if that ends up feeling natural. Alright, the next deck I want to talk about is GLG Misclick's Saruman control deck. Saruman of Many Colors is a 6-mana commander with an ability that triggers on the second spell cast each turn, and gives the ability to cast an opposing instant, sorcery, or enchantment spell for free from a graveyard. This makes for an interesting commander for sure, and the fact that this ended up being a control deck doesn't end up as much of a surprise to me. Speaking of which, this deck is packing 9 counterspells, 8 single-target removal spells, and 7 mass interaction spells that wipe, bounce, or perform a defensive task. To support this, the deck also runs decent counts of both ramp and draw, which hopefully allow it to build up in resources over the course of the game. As some final points to round out the deck and hopefully give it a plan for winning, there are some gameplay amplifiers, a few cards to give the deck additional sources of mill, and a couple cards such as Bloodchief Ascension that reward cards being put into opposing graveyards. I generally like the idea of building around a card like Saruman as the commander for a control deck. He costs a lot of mana, but his effect makes for a great engine, and the fact that he has built-in protection in the form of his unique ward ability takes some of the pressure off of protecting him. I also think the general construction of the deck is relatively solid, and gives some options for progressing the game plan in a proactive direction. Still, the current build of the deck looks maybe a little toothless to me, and a big part of that is the interaction suite. This deck runs quite a lot of low-cost removal, and on some level I get it, since a card like Path to Exile or Thraben Charm makes for a good first spell to set up for a Saruman trigger. But the end result is still less than ideal for a control deck. In my experience, it's best to prioritize mana-efficient removal in fast, proactive decks, and to prioritize card-efficient removal in slower, more reactive decks. One-for-ones just aren't that good in the long term of a game, and this is absolutely a deck that will experience the long term of a game, so I'd try to push the interaction in a more card-efficient direction. I'd be a big fan of something like Tragic Arrogance or Day of the Black Sun, incomplete wipes that keep Saruman around, and there are a variety of other multi-removal options that likewise keep Saruman intact. I'd say make some swaps with card efficiency in mind and try out more like 20 or 21 interaction pieces, and see how that ends up feeling for you. As far as other tweaks for this deck go, it might be interesting to try out some Flash Enablers, plus a couple more mana rocks. Flash Enablers let the deck do more things with enchantments, artifacts, and sorceries, and this might allow for some more flexible plays with some of the pricier cards of these types. You could also amp up the size of the mana rocks rather than just the number, by including some 4 to 5 cost rocks, as these both scale better card for card and give access to an extra higher costed card to trigger Saruman with. Finally, I think the idea of using win cons that take advantage of cards in opposing graveyards is smart, but the selection here currently doesn't impress me that much. Shieldred is fine, but Mnemonic Betrayal kinda does the same thing your commander does, and Bloodchief Ascension feels a bit out of place, given the modest scale on the mill plan and the lack of other incremental damage in the deck. An alternative option you could try is some big reanimation spells. Boneyard Parley, Afterlife from the Loam, Sepulchral Primordial, or the classic Rise of the Dark Realms. To me, these pair nicely vibes-wise with Saruman's non-creature theft plan, and they also have large mana values to grab back juicy spells from opposing yards with Saruman triggers, along with the creatures. The next deck I want to talk about is Ace 117's Bracket 4 Darien deck. This is a mid-range deck that utilizes Darien's unique Tokens Upon Damage effect to try and overwhelm opponents. There are a handful of cards that trigger Darien without opposing help, another handful of other creature token producers, and then a suite of token payoffs made up mainly of Soul Sister style effects. These life gain cards are a pretty sweet value proposition with Darien since you can gain back all the life you lost. So if you're in a situation where an opponent might want to attack you, they're going to have a bummer of a time. In order to protect this sort of powerful defensive strategy, this deck features a pretty healthy range of protective options, most of which are instant speed. This is paired with a beefy removal suite that includes a lovely variety of different options to slow down opponents. Rounding out the deck is a solid ramp package and a fair amount of draw, much of which cares about small creatures entering. I like a lot of what this deck is doing. There's definitely a focus on tightness here, with lots of cards overlapping in roles and doing multiple jobs. The supporting cards here look really great, and a whole lot of what this deck is working with seems well built to grind out opponents, as Ace mentioned as a goal in their submission. I also love the idea of a Bracket 4 Darien deck. I associate him strongly with old school Timmy mid-range games, but there genuinely are places for him to shine in higher power games with the right support. With that said, in its current form, I worry about the level of proactive punch this deck can pack. Darien wants to be a deterrent to attacks, and he wants to put opponents in a pickle of what to do about him plus a Soul Sister, but he can't do that too well unless opponents actually have a reason to attack in. This deck can assemble scary token boards, but it could also just as easily draw into a portion of the deck that doesn't do a whole lot outside from interact with some opposing stuff. For this reason, I think this deck really wants some tutors, more so than the vast majority of decks I mentioned them for. Enlightened Tutor could be good for grabbing a proactive tool like Ankh of Mishra or Cathar's Crusade, or just a powerhouse card like Skullclamp or Smothering Tithe. Some cards to tutor for mana value 1 creatures like Starfield Shepherd or the Eos Bros also have lots of great targets to pick up in this deck, and replacing some of the current selection of life gain sources with these seems helpful for offering the same level of defensive capability with a greater degree of flexibility. These could also be paired with a pivot into some flicker-based protective cards like Ephemerate or Eerie Interlude, as long as you don't mind the tokens themselves not getting protected. Another way to bolster the deck's grindiness in a way that leverages Darien's defensive nature more might be to add some subgame cards that use the Monarch or Initiative mechanics. Palace Jailer and Court of Ardenvale are both great Monarch cards, and White Plume Adventurer and Underseller Sweep are both initiative cards that play into some of this deck's themes. Whether these end up feeling good in practice might depend on how fast opposing decks end up being, but they're at least worth considering. Finally, while I mostly like this deck's interaction suite, it might be worthwhile to consider a bit of stacks to keep other decks in check. Aura of Silence is a great all-around card for slowing down artifact and enchantment decks a bit, and Drannith Magistrate is a spicy boy you could consider here since you already have some stuff that rewards small creatures. I've also been loving Aven Interrupter lately. It's a light stacks effect paired with a Reprieve-style temporary counter, and you get a body on top of it all. Next up, I want to talk about Canny Acumen's deck, Mardu Landfall Burn. This is, as you might expect, a landfall deck that has some creative adaptations to make it work without the color green. The commander is Celes, Rune Knight, here mainly for her ETB, which both filters the deck and allows it to easily toss some stuff into the graveyard. This fuels one of the deck's ways for getting extra lands into play, cards like Squall and Trove Warden that recur low-cost permanents. These are accompanied by a bit of catch-up ramp, a couple creatures that tap to put lands into play, and a couple creatures that ramp a land until they leave play. The biggest source of potential landfall triggers, though, is the 4 Second Sunrise effects, which can be paired with one of the deck's many mass land sacrifice options to generate a whole bunch of landfall triggers, and also probably draw a whole bunch of cards. All of this land enter enabling is in service of a relatively diverse set of landfall cards. 5 of these damage opponents, and the other 5 perform a range of different utility tasks for the deck. With a whole bunch of triggers from these, the deck can hopefully push its way toward victory. So there are a lot of cool ideas here. Celes is a solid pick as a sort of neutral smoothing commander, and while there are a couple other options you could try if you wanted to emphasize different parts of the deck, I don't think they're strict improvements over what you have now. I also love the idea of using white graveyard recursion alongside tools to get lands into the graveyard as a ramp option, as it can actually end up relatively efficient, unlike a lot of versions of non-green ramp. However, despite its undeniable cool factor, the current list feels a bit disjointed, almost like 2 different decks smushed together. You've got your sort of general graveyard-based landfall deck with various ramp sources and so on, and you've also got this more combo-oriented thing with the mass land sacrifice and the Second Sunrise effects. The issue here is that without a source of mass land sack, Second Sunrise effects just aren't all that great, and those sack sources themselves aren't very desirable without the accompanying mass recur spell. It's a bit easier for these to slot smoothly into a deck with green, where the number of lands in play will be generally higher and land recursion is more plentiful, but here I could see these sitting around feeling kinda useless a lot of the time. Likewise, the number of more general graveyard payoffs to work with Celes is relatively small, reducing her utility as a looting commander, and making the more incremental plan less reliable. In terms of fixing this disjointedness, there are a lot of options. I would maybe axe some of the weaker sack sources regardless, but exactly how much this package should be reduced will depend on how you want to tweak this deck. I think leaning harder into the incremental land recursion side of things would be kind of cool and might work better with the commander, with cards like Sun Titan, Redemption Choir, Carmen Cruel Skymarcher, and Savine's Reclamation all recurring low-cost permanents at a solid rate. 3 of these are creatures that do their thing on attack, so you could add some additional combat cards as well to help build advantage while pushing damage at the same time. By leaning into this side of things, you could probably cut all of the Second Sunrise and mass sack stuff and feel just fine. Though if you like that package, there are ways to make it feel more coherent with the rest of the deck. 3 of the mass sacrifice cards in the deck also work for turning tokens into card advantage, so another option would be to push the deck's landfall payoffs in a more tokensy direction. There are 2 token generators currently in the deck, but there are a number of other options for this in a landfall deck. Retreat to Emeria, Nesting Dragon, and Emeria Angel are all great options here, and there are even more landfall cards that buff a wide board. This could be paired with a haste enabler like Anger to really lean into a more explosive playstyle for the deck, making the deck able to suddenly swing in with a board of buffed up tokens with just a bit of setup on previous turns. Taking this approach also may utilize Celes' second line of text better, as on the occasional turn where you can trigger it, you'll have a wider board to receive the counters. The next deck I'll be discussing is Nicholas's deck, Middle-earth Colonialism. This is a deck with Smeagol, Helpful Guide, as its commander, who steals a land from an opponent's deck on each of your end steps if one of your creatures died that turn. Naturally, this ends up being a very rampy Aristocrats deck. There are 7 cards in the deck that want to be sacrificed or want to see something else sacrificed under your control, with these including things like Butcher of Malachor and Pattern of Rebirth. To enable these, there are 11 cards that sacrifice one of your creatures and 7 cards that sacrifice themselves, a healthy count that's hopefully enough to be reliable. The deck's interaction suite is tightly weaved in with these cards, with a large portion of the 19 interaction cards being tied into the Aristocrats package in some way or other, and this holds true for the ramp and draw suites as well, both of which are decent sized in terms of total number of cards. Finally, the deck has a handful of tools that can reanimate various creatures from graveyards, utilizing spare mana to eventually bring the game to a close. The first thing I notice about this deck is that it does an excellent job weaving its Aristocrats game plan into the rest of its deck. The removal is pretty sacrifice focused, the ramp features some Eldrazi token cards that guarantee easy Smeagol triggers, and the value features a lot of cards that use the graveyard, which also pairs nicely with a sacrifice-based game plan. All of that looks good, and seems like it'll likely contribute to a smooth play pattern. However, on the macro level, I do notice a couple potential issues here. The biggest thing I notice is a lack of ways to close out the game. There are a mid-single digit number of cards that can reanimate opposing threats, but not a whole lot else. There aren't any drain payoffs like you might find in other Aristocrats decks, and even more surprisingly, there's a complete lack of landfall in the deck. Outside of cards that hopefully recur big opposing threats, the creatures in this deck just don't hit very hard. Unless this is an active choice you're making with the deck, I'd probably recommend dipping into some of the things I mentioned earlier to let the deck pack more of a punch. Sir Conrad is a great start for a big mana Aristocrats deck, and any manner of landfall creatures, Night Howler style cards to benefit from graveyards, and assorted drain effects can potentially let this deck actually turn on the heat once it's in the driving seat of the game. If the exclusions I mentioned earlier were more intentional and you're not necessarily looking for stronger win cons, that makes things a bit more complicated, but there are still some tweaks you could make to push this deck in the right direction. Nicholas mentioned the deck frequently runs out of cards in hand, which surprised me at first given the total number of value engines in this deck, but made more sense when I thought about it a bit more. To start with, this is a fast ramping deck with a pretty middle-of-the-road curve. All of these 1 and 2 cost cards to trigger Smeagol are pretty ephemeral as top decks go. One solution to this could be pumping up the average mana value a little by cutting lower costed cards for higher costed cards, and you could similarly also add more cards to sink mana into, such as X spells or multi-use abilities. Alternatively, you could take a crack at the value engines themselves. There's a lot of value generation in total, and it's weaved in well with the Aristocrats game plan, but I could see some of it being a little clunky. Oversold Cemetery might be a bit demanding for a deck with 32 creatures, and Gitrog might struggle for sack targets for the same reason. Mimic Vat and Marin are great cards, but they might struggle to push forward your game plan if you don't have a great creature to loop sitting around. An overhaul of the deck's creature base might bolster its graveyard packages, and allow it to crunch value more effectively with its current engines, particularly if you boost the total creature count by 3 or so as well. But you could also try out some larger scale draw as a safer route. Decree of Pain, Moldavine Reclamation, Tireless Tracker, White of the Reliquary even. That one isn't direct draw, but you've got some juicy value lands in your deck to pull out. I'd say start with some beefier draw and or other high cost stuff, but definitely try toying around with the creature based engines. You've got a solid base here, and there are plenty of cool ways to play around with what's already here. Next, I want to talk about Fish Food's Muldrotha deck. Muldrotha is a Sultai commander who allows for casting spells from the graveyard, and here she is paired with the very fun Ixalan artifact, Throne of the Grim Captain. The front side of that card taps to mill 2 cards, and it crafts with one of each of the 4 major Ixalan creature types to flip into the Grim Captain. That card is a 7/7 with a bunch of keywords that also has an attack trigger which causes opponents to sacrifice a creature, and also pops out a creature that crafted it, tapped and attacking. This is a very fun card, and I can see some appeal in pairing it with Muldrotha. Its self-mill effect fuels Muldrotha, and Muldrotha also gives a way to cast Throne from the graveyard in case it dies or another effect mills it. Speaking of which, this deck is packing a bunch of ways to find cards as well as to get stuff into the graveyard. Mill, looting, direct tutors, draw, and more. All of this is in service of the Grim Captain's lineup of friends, 7 each of vampires, dinosaurs, merfolk, and pirates. These serve a variety of roles. A bunch help to get creatures into the graveyard, but there's also some that offer draw, or ramp, or interaction, and a good number that pose a reasonable life total threat with the Grim Captain slinging them. Capping off this deck is a solid number of what I describe simply as Muldrotha cards, various cards that put themselves into the graveyard in some form or other, offering built-in engines to pair with the commander. Generally, there's a lot of fun stuff here. Throne is a super cool card, and this deck does a good job building around it, weaving together graveyard feeding and various creature types into a package that seems pretty cohesive. The one possibly less clear element is how this deck wins, but this is probably fine since Muldrotha is a control commander and this deck has plenty of ways to assemble removal engines and value engines. So no major notes on the build quality here. Great job, Fish Food. For that reason, this is going to be different from most of my other reviews because I'm going to focus on possible major tweaks to this deck from here on out, principally alternative commander options. Fish Food mentioned that Muldrotha has a tendency to outshine the Grim Captain, and I fully believe that. Muldrotha is a total main character commander. The card is powerful, and its play pattern is pretty iconic, so it's kind of hard to pair that with other things. It is nice that it pairs with the graveyard enabling of the Grim Captain, but there are other Sultai commanders that also work with the card, and I have identified 3 options that I like with somewhat different playstyles. Starting with the safest option, Glarb is a very solid generic Sultai commander. He compounds the graveyard themes with his surveilling, and being able to look at the top card of your library also gives some nice extra information for turn ordering, and avoiding dumping anything critical with Throne of the Grim Captain. One rung spicier than Glarb would be Yarok, a 5-mana card that doubles ETBs. This deck already has a decent count of ETBs for tutoring and other tasks, and it wouldn't be too hard to add in some extras to make Yarok feel even more at home, since all 4 creature types have plenty of decent ETBs. The third and spiciest option for commander I'm presenting here would be Felix 5-Boots, who doubles combat damage triggers. There are some decent options for this in 3 of the 4 types the Grim Captain uses, but dinosaurs would get left out a little, with only 2 cards that have combat damage triggers. This one is probably the trickiest to make work, but it's also probably the one I'd choose personally, as long as power isn't the primary goal. And given the amount of filtering this deck has, I think having unequal numbers of the different creature types could be fine if some work better than others. Next up, let's take things back to a nice crisp monocolor deck, Josh's budget Aphemia deck. Aphemia is a card that can exile an enchantment card from your graveyard each turn to create a zombie, so naturally this is an enchantments deck that also has some token themes in it. One major thing I note here is that this deck is packing a lot of enchantments, a whole 16 enchantment creatures as well as 28 non-creature enchantments. Most of the non-creature enchantments seem clearly intended to get into the graveyard as smoothly as possible, such as a number that sacrifice themselves as well as a number that enchant and probably kill opposing creatures. Paired with a bit of mill, it seems like this deck is going to be more than capable of having targets for its Aphemia triggers. There's also a light sacrifice theme present in this deck, featuring a handful of bargain cards from Wilds of Eldraine, as well as related cards like Malevolent Witchkite, which can turn tokens into a lot of value. So this deck has a couple very visible priorities, a high overall enchantment count, and a large number of enchantments that get themselves into the graveyard. Some of this I like. Seal of Doom and Sinister Concoction are both passable removal options that feed Aphemia, and I also like the inclusion of sagas such as the Eldest Reborn and Elspeth's Nightmare, which get some value before later dumping themselves into the yard. I likewise don't mind a lot of the enchantment creatures that serve to pump up the enchantment count here. Mindrak Harpy and Dockside Chef both tie nicely into this deck's game plan, and even a handful of others that aren't as directly tied into the tokens plan, such as Night Howler and Fate Unraveler, still seem solid for putting some pressure on opponents. With that said, this deck still seems likely to experience stallouts and struggle later in the game, and that's because the things this deck is prioritizing currently aren't all that great on the scale of the EDH format. Aphemia is a fun commander. She's cheap to cast, she has a reliable effect, and she herself has multiple card types. However, for all these upsides, her effect isn't particularly high-powered, and it simply doesn't scale well on its own. This deck does seem like it'll reliably have enchantments in the graveyard to trigger Aphemia, but these triggers alone won't win you games, and putting too much focus on this single aspect of the deck seems like it's probably taking away space from cards that could support your game plan in other ways. The 2 biggest examples of this here are the auras and the enchantment creatures. Deadweight style cards, though great at cutting down an opponent's single small creature, aren't great in terms of scaling and flexibility, and additionally, a lot of the common and uncommon Theros enchantment creatures like Spiteful Returned and Gnarled Scarhide seem unlikely to scale well in the landscape of EDH either. For building out a deck like this, I would start by constructing a roadmap of what the deck is doing. Like, we could say the deck is trying to cast Aphemia, get enchantments into the graveyard so she can turn them into zombies, and then do things with those zombies to pressure opponents. Then, we can start to grab cards that accomplish these different tasks, and importantly, ask what else these cards might be able to do. For example, with the Enabling Aphemia triggers goal, instead of running so many enchantments that get themselves into the graveyard, I might add more mill. Cards like Cemetery Tampering, Stitcher's Supplier, Millikin, and Liliana Death's Majesty. Then you can ask, what else can I do with having extra cards in the graveyard? You could add a card like Polluted Cistern or Sir Conrad the Grim that reward milling directly while also doing another task, and you could additionally add a bit more recursion to pull things from the graveyard, or delve cards to utilize the extra material in the graveyard. Then, if you've increased the amount of stuff that will be leaving your graveyard, you could look into things that trigger off of that, like Soul Enervation and Defiled Crypt, amplifying the ongoing pressure that Aphemia can offer. Alternatively, we can move on to the later stage and think about what we want to do with extra zombies. If we're attacking with them, you could look into something like Liliana's Mastery or Archetype of Finality to make those attacks more effective, with both of those cards also being enchantments. You could also sacrifice them to various black effects, and that sacrificing can be paired with something like Bastion of Remembrance or Agent of the Iron Throne to drain opponents. There are a bunch of different ways you could take this, and I'd recommend mixing and matching a bit, keeping a strong focus on synergy and the ways your different cards pair together to build extra value and put on extra pressure. Pivoting to the funkier end of Bracket 2, the next deck I want to talk about is Jay's deck, 5 Nights at the Chaos Shrine. This is a Garland deck that focuses on weird interactions with both cards that gain control of things and cards that grant control of things. Garland Royal Kidnapper is a 4-mana 3/4 in Dimir that grants the monarchy to an opponent when it enters, gains control of an opposing creature when an opponent gains the monarchy, for as long as they have the monarchy, and also gives non-owned creatures +2/+2 and prevents them from being sacrificed. I'm giving a full summary of this card because it is weird and new, and this deck makes use of a lot of specific things about it. The biggest synergies are with Assault Suit and John Irenicus. A downside of Assault Suit is that it turns one of your creatures into a public beatstick, and that downside is mostly negated if you use it on an opponent's creature that you temporarily control. The same goes for John Irenicus, who normally hands opponents your terrible creatures, but here instead hands them a creature you only had temporary control of, for a different but still nice result. Another big feature of this deck is that it has a lot of evasive creatures, as well as a lot of value engines that trigger when creatures hit opponents, and this gives it both some pressure and a consistent way to build up the scale of a game plan. Finally, there are a couple far more specific synergy packages, with one of those focusing around the can't be sacrificed line of text, and another being manipulating finality counters. Between all of these, this deck has a pretty unique political play pattern. Firstly, I love the creativity and nicheness of some of the interactions here. These are super cool ideas. I would not have thought to play around with can't be sacrificed as a line of text, but it seems like an oddly effective idea when executed properly, particularly with the John Irenicus Homeward Path combination. I also like the choice to pair the deck's more specific plans with the more generalist plan of evasive creatures combat damage, as that both has some built-in synergy and is a good way to let the deck feel unique without feeling useless. So overall, I enjoyed this deck a lot, but I think it's interesting to think about how you might pump up the funk and the flavor of this sort of deck, which seems like it's the goal based on what Jay said in their submission. If you were trying to power this deck up, you'd add a bunch of the flicker engines that are worded in a way to permanently gain control of opposing creatures, but I think it's more interesting to limit that to just the one-off ghostly flicker and do other things with the stolen creatures instead, as seems to be happening with this deck. Firstly, on the question of tutors, I don't think it's a bad thing to run tutors for John and Assault Suit, as that'll let the deck do what it wants to be doing more, rather than being a more generic Flying Men deck a larger amount of the time. Mana value 4 tutors, like Clutch of the Undercity and Transit Mage, seem like a nice choice here, as they can grab one of your key cards, but they can also grab a value engine, or even a piece of interaction. I've found that the specificity of these sorts of tutors helps them present less sweaty than some other tutors out there, and in my experience there's also a dramatic difference between a deck with 3 tutors and a deck with 8 or 10. In terms of what other cool stuff you could add here, I have a handful of ideas. Kaya's Ghost Form is a fun card that could be protection, but could also be a way of permanently stealing the garlanded creature sometime in the future. Fateful Handoff is a draw spell that can be used on a garlanded creature to permanently give it to a different opponent, getting some decent value in the process. Aside from these two, my other ideas are equipment. Nemesis Mask is a hilarious political tool, and Grappling Hook is a similar card that gives you a bit more control over the outcome, particularly if the opponent attacks you with the hooked creature. Blade of Shared Souls is a card you could do some weird stuff with, and Vorpal Sword is also conceptually amusing to stick on an opposing creature, since you maintain control over whether to ultimately pull the trigger. The next deck I'll be talking about is Dak Goodboy Man's Wort combo deck. Wort the Raid Mother is a classic Gruul spell copy commander, but she's not really the star of this deck. That honor goes to the little remembered incarnation creature, Hostility. This is a 6-mana creature with the fascinating text line, if a spell you control would deal damage to an opponent, prevent that damage. Create a 3/1 elemental shaman creature token with haste for each 1 damage prevented this way. So that ends up being the bedrock of this deck's combo. Since this is EDH, it's not hard to do a large amount of total damage to opponents with a single spell like Price of Progress, and even the 1-mana spell Bolt Wave gets you 9 hasty little elemental guys. Pair that with a spell doubler commander, and you've got quite a lot of OTK potential you're playing with. So that's a big part of this deck. Draw to build up value, some ramp, and then a number of damage spells to close things out once Hostility is in play. The final element here is the method of obtaining Hostility, a mixture of tutors and polymorph effects, the latter of which takes advantage of this deck's very low creature count and token creating commander. For starters, I like that this deck builds around an underutilized creature, and Wort pairs nicely with Hostility in a couple clear ways. Copying a damage spell is one nice feature, and using the tokens to polymorph out Hostility is an even more creative use case. With that being said, when it comes to the specifics of this Hostility acquisition plan, there are some things I'm not all that sold on. Among the non-creature options, Bag of Tricks and Shifting Shadow both seem pretty clunky, and I don't like the creature options much better. Aspiring Champion gets Hostility into play at the end of combat, preventing a swing that turn, and Thicket Elemental has the downside that it's just a vanilla 4/4 if you pop it into play with something else. Personally, I'd full commit to the polymorph Hostility plan and cut the 3 remaining non-hostility creatures, replacing them with the more classic polymorph choices of Reality Scramble, Transmogrify, and Divergent Transformations. This will also likely increase the mana efficiency of the deck's plays, which is important because that's something of a weakness that I'd expect. A lot of this deck's big plays demand quite a bit of mana. The commander is 6 mana, Hostility costs 6 mana to hardcast, most of the deck's damaging spells cost 4 or more mana, and a number of draw spells and play extenders also cost 4 or more mana. With that in mind, I'm a bit worried about this deck's counts of lands and ramp, 37 and 11 respectively. These aren't horribly low, but I think missed land drops will feel a lot worse here than in some decks, and preventing them should be a priority. Getting the deck more mana will also indirectly reduce the need for protection spells, since the deck will be better at bouncing back, and will also be more able to play its important spells in a single turn rather than spacing them out and passing the turn with vulnerable permanents in play. One option if you're concerned with deck space would be to use ramp that also fulfills another function for the deck, such as Pier's Whim or Dire Strain Rampage as a removal source, or Titania's command to pump up elementals in the late game. Likewise, for lands, you could add a utility land or two, such as Carekeep, Colony Garden, and Shivan Gorge. Finally, while this deck does have protection and a centerpiece card with a bit of built-in durability, fleshing out a small secondary plan could be worthwhile. The best way to do this is to look at the cards involved in the combo and try to figure out something else that also works well alongside these. Something that caught my eye was a handful of enchantments that basically do nothing unless the deck is actively creating a bunch of moderately large tokens. So, I think we should add a handful of instants and sorceries that can create a bunch of tokens with power 3 or greater. Azuri's Predation is the king of this, despite its subtle anti-synergy with Wort, but there are other token-creating options as well. Wild Endeavor if you want something that can also ramp, Elemental Eruption if you're feeling stormy, or Rite of the Dragoncaller if you want a great standalone enchantment. As a final note, one of the biggest parts of building this sort of soft combo deck in EDH will be balancing how effective the central cards are in the combo versus how much they blend into the rest of the deck. Looking at the damage cards in this deck, we can kind of see this at play. The lower costed damage options seem likely better in a combo scenario, while the higher costed ones are a bit clunkier but nice for Wort copying outside of comboing. I don't have strong opinions about what the optimal choices are, but just keep an eye on how cards are feeling, and don't be afraid to switch things up. The final deck I want to talk about is Vanille's Voltron deck, Gilgamesh. This is a deck built around Gilgamesh, Master at Arms, a 6-mana red commander who scoops all the equipment out of the top 6 cards of your library on ETB or attack, and equips one of them to himself. Naturally, this encourages a high equipment count, and this deck runs a healthy 25 equipments, so you're looking at usually getting 1 to 2 per trigger. These serve a variety of different purposes, but the biggest two are granting evasion and pumping up the size of the commander. Paired with some extra combat spells and a healthy range of options for granting haste, this deck is clearly looking to get a healthy number of Gilgamesh triggers and subdue opponents with a heavily equipped Gilgamesh. To support this game plan, there's a modest suite of draw spells, a fair amount of ramp, and a small handful of cards for slowing down opposing game plans. For starters, I'll say that being a Voltron deck with a 6-mana commander, this deck does have some clear natural challenges, though the current form of the deck is actually not doing a bad job with those. For one, the commander is going to be a big potential point of failure for the deck, since if it gets bullied off the board repeatedly, the deck might lose momentum. This is still likely going to be the deck's biggest problem, but the presence of some protection and a lot of ramp seems like it'll work decently to keep Gilgamesh getting in for damage. The other thing I like is the number of haste enablers in the deck, since you effectively get to double the number of Gilgamesh triggers the turn he hits the field. This gives ample opportunities to stumble upon protection equipments, and the fact that you're getting 1 to 2 triggers even if Gilgamesh doesn't survive the turn cycle means that you're at least getting some value out of casting him. So overall, not bad, but I'd probably commit just a bit harder to these elements, add another protection equipment or two, and maybe consider a haste-granting land like Henware Battlements or Flamekin Village as a low-investment way to further push up the deck's likelihood of having haste. The second potential problem I see here is having mana to equip everything this deck wants to, since Gilgamesh spits equipments onto the board with nice efficiency, but can't pay for the equip costs on already in-play equipments. The deck's healthy quantity of ramp definitely helps here, and there's also some equipment-specific choices like Kazul's Toll Collector and Raban. I could see even more equip cheating feeling good, and I'm a big fan of Armory Automaton personally, but this sort of thing you just need to feel out a bit, as how much of this you want will depend a lot on the table and group-specific factors. I would also probably lean toward options with higher mana costs and lower equip costs, since Gilgamesh seems better at cheating the mana cost part of things. High mana equipments like Nazgul Battle Mace, Meteor Sword, and Argentum Armor seem potentially fun to play around with, and on the opposite end of things, I don't really see the appeal of the Colossus Hammer that's currently in the deck. Those particular high-cost equipment I mentioned also might gesture at the final thing I wouldn't mind seeing for this deck, and that's a bit more interaction. It can be on an equipment, it can be on a land, but I think just a bit more would be helpful here. Vanille also specifically mentioned wanting defensive tools, but feeling uncertain about the level of sweatiness on some of them, with Glacial Crevasses being a big example. It's up to you to decide what feels right for your games, but there are a couple defensive options a step down from that could be worth trying out. Firstly, Komenu Battle Armor, which is also an equipment creature. Voltron decks generally have great tools once you're down to a 1v1 situation, and Goad seems like a nice way to get there. Secondly, Silent Arbiter is also nice, still allowing for one attacking creature from each opponent, but heavily favoring a Voltron deck. Alright, those are the reviews. Decks linked in the description. Have yourself a lovely day and a lovelier week.